Charles Robert Darwin is the founder of the theory of evolution by natural selection. He claimed that all living species, including humans, evolved from one or more common ancestors through natural selection, and presented a lot of evidence to support this theory, according to the conditions of the day. The modern theory of evolution, built on Darwin's ideas, is today the foundation and unifying element of biological science. Darwin was born on February 12, 1809, in the town of Shrewsbury in the Shropshire region of the United Kingdom. His father, Robert Darwin, and grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, were famous doctors. At the age of 8, he began his education as a boarding student at Shrewsbury School in September 1818, after the death of his mother. After graduating in 1825, Darwin worked for his father as a medical intern for a while, then enrolled in the medical school of Edinburgh University in Scotland. However, he could not warm up to surgery and started to skip medicine courses. He learned taxidermy, the art of stuffing animals, from a freed slave of Guyana origin who worked at the school. He joined the Plinius Society, founded by students interested in natural history. He learned Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's theory of evolution from his teacher, Robert Edmund Grant, and together with Grant, he studied sea creatures and found homology examples that support the theory of evolution from common ancestors. He took classes on geology and plant classification from another teacher, Robert Jameson, and helped Jameson organize the plant collection of the Royal Museum of Edinburgh. Realizing that Darwin had neglected his medical education, his father took him from Edinburgh in 1827 and enrolled him in Christ's College, Cambridge University. He hoped that Darwin would study theology and become a clergyman. Darwin was more successful in theology than in medicine and even admired the writings of the theologian William Paley, which linked the complexity of living things to a gifted creator, but his main interest was still natural history. He enjoyed collecting insects with William Darwin Fox. Thanks to his interest in insects, Darwin met the botanist Professor John Stevens Henslow, became close friends with this professor, and both enrolled in Henslow's natural history course and began taking private lessons from him. Thanks in part to these lectures, he graduated 10th in his 178-man circuit in 1831. In the fall of 1831, Henslow introduced Darwin to Robert Fitzroy, the captain of the HMS Beagle. The Beagle was to embark on a 2-year South American voyage under Fitzroy in December 1831, and the captain wanted a well-trained naturalist to accompany him on the way. On Henslow's advice, Fitzroy agreed to take Darwin on his ship. Thus began the famous journey that now leads us to know Darwin's name. HMS Beagle's journey took 5 years instead of 2. Along the way, Darwin discovered and collected samples of a wide variety of geological formations, fossils, and living things. Whenever he could, he wrote detailed letters to Cambridge describing his discoveries, posting interesting specimens he had collected. Thanks to this, he became well known among English naturalists, although he was far away. In his diary, which he kept throughout the journey, he wrote down his cultural and anthropological observations of the different human societies he encountered, as well as his natural scientific discoveries. He would publish this diary in 1839 as the Voyage of the Beagle. At the beginning of the voyage, Captain Fitzroy had given Darwin Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology. In this book, Lyell argued that geological formations were formed as a result of very long ages, with the effect of very slow processes that continue today. When Darwin found coral and shell remnants on the high slopes of volcanic rock on the island of Santiago, off West Africa, he realized that these slopes had once been under the sea and had risen slowly over the ages, as Lyell had said. Darwin would make many other important geological discoveries along the way. This changed his view of nature. Darwin found fossils of huge extinct mammals in South America. The layers where these fossils were found also contained the remains of modern crustaceans, meaning that these mammals had recently become extinct without any climate change or disaster. However, the prevailing view at the time was that the fossils were animals that died in major disasters such as Noah's flood. Darwin thought that these animals were related to similar African and European species, whereas British biologist Richard Owen would show in 1836 that these animals were much closer to modern South American species, adding further support to the idea of natural selection taking shape in Darwin's mind. The second volume of Principles of Geology, published in 1832, was mailed to Darwin in South America. In this volume, Charles Lyell opposed the idea of evolution and explained the distribution of biological species with the idea of centers of creation. However, while Darwin was reading this, he was also making very important observations that would later support his theory of evolution. He collected several specimens of mockingbirds from the Galapagos Islands and noticed that these birds showed slight physiological differences to the islands they inhabited. He learned that the local Spaniards could tell which island a turtle came from by looking at its appearance. And if my suspicions about mockingbirds and tortoises were correct, he would write as he edited his notes on his return trip to Britain, the idea of the immutability of species would be shaken. The possums, kangaroos, and platypuses he saw in Australia surprised Darwin so much that he thought that Earth's creatures were created by two separate creators. The letters, fossil specimens, and stuffed creatures that Darwin sent to Britain while he was traveling were transferred to British naturalists through his former teacher, Henslow, and Darwin's reputation was gradually spreading. When the Beagle returned to Britain on October 2, 1836, Darwin was recognized as a respected naturalist. After landing in Britain, Darwin came to Cambridge to work on the identification and classification of the specimens he had collected on his Beagle voyage. But for animal specimens, Darwin needed expert zoologists. With the financial support of his father, Darwin went to London to meet with zoologists and met a biologist named Richard Owen through Charles Lyell. By examining the fossils Darwin brought, Owen identified many extinct animal species that were unknown until then. Among these species were large sloth-like mammals, a hippopotamus-like herbivore mammal, and a giant armored mammal like an armadillo. These animals were anatomically close to South American animals, not to African animals as Darwin thought. Darwin wrote a scientific paper on the rising of the South American continent in December 1836 and presented it to the Geological Society of London in January 1837, with Lyell's support. On the same day, he presented the bird and mammal specimens he collected on his Beagle voyage to the Zoological Society of London. Ornithologist John Gould explained that a group of birds that Darwin could not identify and assumed belonged to different species were actually 12 new species of finches very close to each other. Darwin was elected to the Geographical Society Council in February 1837 and moved from Cambridge to London a month later. Darwin's professor at Edinburgh University, Robert Edmund Grant, and doctor he claimed that a group of scientists like James Gully could transform species into each other, but because of these ideas, he was accused by the majority of heresy and of trying to disrupt the social order. By April 1837, Darwin understood that birds that migrated from the mainland and settled on different islands had somehow changed over time and turned into different species. In July, he began keeping a secret bee diary, in which, alongside his usual diary, he wrote down his ideas about the interconversion of species. He drew an evolutionary tree for the first time on page 36 of this diary. While working on the evolution of species, Darwin was also editing the Beagle diaries and writing a South American geology book to support Charles Lyell's ideas. On top of all this, he started working on a comprehensive work that would include expert opinions on the examples he had brought. In the end, he couldn't stand this high work pace and his heart was sick. In September 1837, on the advice of a doctor, he interrupted his studies. Continuing his research in London, Darwin made very important developments in the transformation of species. Thomas Malthus's an essay on the principle of the population was an important source of inspiration for Darwin. In this article, Malthus explained that the human population actually had the potential to multiply rapidly, but that the population was kept under control thanks to disease, wars, and starvation. Darwin realized that the same principle could be applied to all organisms. All living species produced far more offspring than available resources allowed. The weak offspring soon died, while the strong ones survived to produce offspring and pass on traits that made them strong to their offspring. Thus, species changed from generation to generation, adapting better to their environment. He wrote this theory for the first time in his diary on September 28, 1838. Darwin had laid the groundwork for the idea of natural selection, but he knew he had to work hard to convince his skeptical colleagues. At the Geological Society's meeting in December 1838, he had witnessed firsthand how vehemently his old teacher, Robert Edmund Grant, who advocated the idea of evolution, was opposed. He continued to interview animal breeders and conduct experiments on plants to find evidence to support his theory. Opening his ideas to his botanist friend Joseph Dalton Hooker, Darwin felt as if he were confessing to a murder, but Hooker liked Darwin's theory. When the book called Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, which was published anonymously in October 1844 and which argues that all living things, including humans, emerged by transforming from primitive forms, was slammed on the ground by naturalists, Darwin once again realized how careful he had to be about his theory. The book attracted great interest from the London middle class and once again brought up the issue of the transformation of species. Darwin published his third geology book in 1846 and, together with his friend Hooker, began an extensive study of shellfish. In 1847, Hooker read Darwin's long essay on natural selection and offered unbiased criticisms, but also questioned Darwin's opposition to the idea of creation. Describing the results of his studies on shellfish in a series of books published between 1851 and 1854, Darwin was awarded a medal by the Royal Society in 1853 for this work. In addition, this work made Darwin, who was known as a geologist until then, also famous as a biologist. In his study of shellfish, Darwin observed evidence that an organ with a certain function can change its function by undergoing minor changes as a result of changing conditions. In November 1854, he wrote in his notes that living things descended from a common ancestor could diverge anatomically from one another as a result of adapting to discrete places in nature's economy. Then, Darwin devoted all his energies to finishing his book, and on the origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favorite races in the struggle for life, was first distributed to bookstores on November 22, 1859. The book, which quickly gained immense popularity and went out of print, defended the idea of natural selection on the basis of detailed observation and careful logical deduction, answering some potential objections in advance. The book did not directly refer to human evolution, but only said that the theory could shed light on the origin and history of man. A sentence he wrote in the introduction simply summed up Darwin's theory. Since each species gives birth to more individuals than is possible for it to survive, and as a result there is an often recurring battle for survival, any living thing that has any beneficial changes in the complex and occasionally changing conditions of life has a higher chance of survival, and will naturally be chosen. Thanks to the strong principle of heredity, each selected breed will tend to propagate its own new and different form. Darwin's book was met with great interest and sparked widespread debate. Darwin closely followed the controversies created by his book and carefully cut out and preserved the criticisms, comments, and cartoons published about the book. The claim that man comes from animals, which is not directly included in the book, was the main target of criticism. While influential Church of England scientists, including Darwin's former teachers Adam Sedgwick and John Henslow, were openly opposed to the book, many young naturalists responded favorably to the book. Essays and reviews, published by 7 Anglican theologians in 1860, received a strong reaction from the Church for supporting Darwin's theory. The most famous debate on the origin of species took place in June 1860 at the Oxford meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. When Oxford Bishop Samuel Wilberforce gave a speech that disparaged Darwin's book, he found Darwin's friends Joseph Hooker and Thomas Huxley. Huxley defended Darwin so vigorously that he was nicknamed Darwin's Bulldog from then on. According to a frequently told story about this debate, Wilberforce asks Huxley, "Did your monkey come from your grandparents' side?" When asked, Huxley replied that he would rather come from a monkey than a cultured human who uses his knowledge to serve prejudice and lies. Darwin was following these debates, which he could not attend personally due to his illness, from the press, trying to find more supporters through correspondence. In 1864, Darwin was awarded the Copley Medal of the Royal Society after staunch defenders of Darwin, Thomas Huxley, Charles Lyell, and Joseph Hooker, succeeded in suppressing the dissident group led by Richard Owen. The Origin of Species, which was published in many editions and translated into many languages in a short time, became one of the most read scientific books by the European middle class, who were just beginning to be curious about scientific subjects. It directly or indirectly influenced the social movements of its time and became an important part of popular culture. He was buried in Westminster Abbey on the afternoon of April 26, when Charles Darwin, an agnostic and apostate, died on April 19, 1882. Among those carrying his coffin were his old friend, botanist Joseph Dalton Hooker, the young naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace, whose writings prompted Darwin to publish his theory, and James Russell Lowell, the U.S. ambassador to the UK. Darwin's tomb is in the section of this church known as the Scholars' Corner, a few meters from where Sir Isaac Newton is buried and next to the astronomer Sir John Herschel. Thanks to his works, he wrote his name in history with golden letters due to his contributions to science and especially to biology. Since you've watched it so far, you can click the subscribe button under the video and like the video. See you in the next video.